I'd consider my career in photography mainly a blur. Right, today's video, you can feel the excitement in my voice. We're going to look at the demographic transition model and the link between that and the level of development. This model is nothing to be scared of. It's a very, very straightforward, simple model. We'll go through each of the stages. We'll link it to development on the whole as we go. Use some example case study countries that we've studied in the AQA course. It is nice and straightforward. We will make it as easy as we possibly can. So first off, what is the demographic transition model? It's a model of population change as a country experiences economic development. So how the structure of a population changes as a country goes through those stages of economic development. It's based on the experience of European countries over the past 200 or so years, from predating the Industrial Revolution up until the present day. So here is the demographic transition model. It can look a little bit complicated at the start. We do have two y-axes and two x-axes, which always make graphs a little bit more tricky. But before we go into this graph, what I just want you to remember regarding population is, if you ever see that word population change, what I want you to consider is a bathtub. Now, quite simply, in a bathtub example, if you have more water going in from the tap than leaving through the plug hole, the level of water will increase in the bath. Oh, well, conversely, if you have less water going in through the tap and more water leaving through the plug, the level of water in the bath will decrease. With that in mind, all I need you to consider here is that the blue line, your birth rate, is the amount of water going in. The green line, the death rate, is the amount of water leaving the bathtub, and the red line is the overall volume of water within the bath. As soon as you consider that, it becomes very, very straightforward. If the birth rate is higher than the death rate, the overall population will increase. If, however, the death rate is higher than the birth rate, overall, the population level will decrease. If they are very close together, they'll have a slower rate of change. If the birth rate and death rate are similar, you'll have a slower rate of change. The bigger the gap between them, obviously, the larger the rate of change will be, whether that's positive or negative. If you were to get this model in this version, I should say, of the DTM in the exam, this is probably the most complicated version, as they've actually given figures for death rate and birth rate. Right, let's have a little look at each of the stages in turn, and we'll try and work out what on earth this shows about the economic development of countries around the world. Okay, let's start from the start of this model. Stage 1, the earliest point of the demographic transition model. I just point out I've also added a population pyramid on the right-hand side. I'll use that in a moment. Quick description of the stage. Firstly, thing to identify, there are no countries around the world that currently find themselves in stage 1. All recognised countries by the United Nations have actually now moved into at least the early stages of stage 2, although there are certain regions of the world and certain groups of people that you'd still consider stage 1. For example, the Yanomami people of the Amazon rainforest, or very rural tribes in the Solomon Islands or the Democratic Republic of Congo as an example. In these communities, you have a very, very high birth rate and a very high death rate that both fluctuate, both very, very high though. What's slightly misleading on this graph is that red total population line doesn't fluctuate as well. Really, if the death rate is higher than the birth rate, that red line should also show a decline at the same point. Despite that, they have got the second part of the total population line correct, which is the concept that quite simply the population will stay very low. Although you have a very high birth rate, you have a very high death rate, so the population stays relatively constant at a very, very low figure. So let's talk through the reasons for this and link it to economic development. Why do stage 1 countries have a high birth rate? Well, probably the main reason is that these communities, if you will, or formerly countries would have been in this stage, are based on a subsistence agriculture economy. Subsistence agriculture, as a quick reminder, is the concept of growing enough food for yourself and your family, but not to sell on a mass market. And that really explains a high birth rate on the basis that there's a need for a very large family to grow more food. The more children you have, the more workers you have that you don't have to necessarily pay. And as a result, you're going to grow more food. It means your family will be stronger and healthier because you'll have a higher calorie intake. So you have more children to ensure you have a large workforce. Furthermore, in a stage 1 community, there's going to be a lack of contraception for the basic reason that it hasn't been invented yet. As a result, when males and females hug in a special way, the lack of contraception means that it's far more likely that a woman will fall pregnant, and therefore that contributes to the high birth rate. In addition, the high death rate also links to the high birth rate here on the basis you have a high infant mortality rate, the number of children who are going to die before age 1. This is due to a lack of healthcare, for example, a lack of inoculations. In addition, the inability to clean water to make the water potable to drink also leads to the spread of diseases like cholera and typhoid. And with that in mind, the death rate is very, very, very high in this society, and as a result, it leads to a high birth rate for the need to almost fill the gap for those people who are dying. You need people to be born to do the jobs that they would have done. And the high death rate literally dictates a high birth rate on the basis that parents can't have the confidence that children will survive beyond the age of 1. So they have a number of children on the basis that at least some of them will survive to adulthood, and at least some of them will be able to provide food for the rest of the family. Another reason for the high death rate is as a subsistence agricultural economy, you are heavily reliant on nature / the climate. If the rains do not come, or if there is a big storm that destroys crops, you will not have the technological will or might to put that right. And as a result, you're going to have lots of your population dying from a lack of food, dying of starvation and malnutrition. With that in mind, a stage 1 country will be maintaining that high death rate and high birth rate on the basis that even though there may not be enough food to go around, you will need more children to make sure that if the rains come, you have enough people to grow the crops there. What we end up with is a population pyramid that looks like this. Population pyramids are again something that students can get a little bit scared about, the blue being males in this one, and the pinks obviously being females. Essentially, this is just two area graphs just stuck together. What you need to be able to identify with this is look at the very wide base, that's showing a very high birth rate, but look at the rapid decline inwards before the age of 15, showing you 1, a high infant mortality rate, and 2, a high death rate. And look at that, very, very, very thin top in a stage 1 country, showing a very low life expectancy. So what you should be able to drag out of a pyramid that looks like this is that actually you're going to have a lack of contraception on the basis of such a high birth rate, and also a lack of healthcare provision on the amount of people that are dying as you go up through this graph. A low life expectancy further gives you evidence of a poor or lack of healthcare provision in this country. So that's stage 1. Let's have a quick look at stage 2. In stage 2, look at the death rate here. The death rate begins to rapidly decline, and as a result there is a big gap between birth rate and death rate, which means the population rapidly expands and rapidly increases. Countries around the world that consider or still find themselves in stage 2 are your LIC countries. Taking Tanzania as an example, the birth rate in Tanzania is approximately 36 people per 1,000, whereas the death rate is as low as 8 per 1,000. As a result of that, the population of Tanzania increases around about 2 to 3% every year. This also would apply to Kenya, one of your other case study countries as well. So, let's have a quick talk through this. Why is the death rate decreasing so rapidly in these countries? Well, the main reason here is due to healthcare advances. Okay, advances in healthcare means that people who would have died previously of conditions like cholera and typhoid may now actually survive due to those advances. Now, that could be from the country itself developing its own medicines, remedies against those, or it could be through aid from richer countries, stage 3, stage 4, even stage 5 countries, going into those countries and providing assistance on the healthcare. A second reason, also linked to economic development, is the development in agriculture. This means more food will be grown, there'll be a higher calorie intake on the basis of mechanisation of the farming process, for example, combine harvesters. Now again, that could be development in the country itself, naturally reaching that technological advance, or it could be aid given. As a result of those advances, you have less people dying in terms of diseases, preventable diseases like cholera and typhoid, or even potentially malaria, or alternatively, less people dying of starvation. Now then, in a stage 2 country, the birth rate does, however, maintain a very, very high position. Now, the reason for that is, although there is economic development happening, the vast majority of people in these countries will still work in agriculture. Take Tanzania as an example, around about 80% of the population are employed in agriculture. As a result, you will still need a high birth rate, because you're going to still need the ability for children to work on your farms. You're not at the stage yet where farmers can actually simply pay to employ people, because they don't earn enough money from their own farming, so still have a lot of children to ensure that they can work on those farms. What this leads to is a huge population increase as the children now begin to survive, as the infant mortality rate drops, and as a result the population expands rapidly, particularly in rural areas. Look at the stage 2 population pyramid quickly. You can see we've still got a very wide base, but in comparison to stage 1, the level of decline is much lower. Don't be wrong, we've still got a higher death rate than a stage 4 country, shown by the pyramid shape. As people are going up through the ages, the amount of them is declining, and the life expectancy in those people over the age of 65 is still quite thin, but the concept is that it's not as thin as a stage 1 country would have been. Right, moving on to the tricky bit. For all students studying the exams for the years 2020 onwards, you will have a new case study which is up on the board here. It's your LIC or Stage 2 case study, which is Kenya. The birth rate of Kenya, 37 per 1,000, very, very, very high figure. Indicative of a stage 2 country, where the death rate is dropping. It's already down to 10 per 1,000, decreasing rapidly. That's indicative of an improving healthcare system. The natural population increase of 2.5% is as a result of people still not being confident that children will survive, so having a lot of children, and the population therefore growing rapidly as the death rate decreases. Life expectancy, 57, is a low life expectancy figure. However, this is increasing rapidly, again due to the improving healthcare within Kenya. However, at the moment, Kenya is still a very youthful population, a median age of just 18, which is the concept that if you lined everybody up in Kenya, the person right in the middle would only be 18 years old. Stage 3 is where this gets a little bit more tricky. What you have to remember as time is progressing through each of these stages is the concept that you are constantly having further economic and technological development. Now in stage 3, what this leads to is a declining birth rate, as well as a still declining death rate as well. Now, the reasons for a declining death rate actually link back to the stage 2 reasons, where quite simply healthcare advances are continuing, and therefore more and more diseases that formerly would have been fatal are now being treated. We had cholera, typhoid and malaria previously in stage 2. The concept in stage 3 is that more and more people will be accessing those healthcare advances and therefore reducing the death rate. You'll also have advances in prenatal care and antenatal care, and as a result of that, the infant mortality rate also declines rapidly as well. But what's the reason for a declining birth rate here? Well, we've got the continued mechanisation of farming. As a result of technological and economic development now reaching rural areas as well as urban areas, it means that less children are needed to work on the farms. And as a result of that, farmers now have the ability to not have as many children, but buy in technology to their, e.g. a combine harvester, so therefore more crops are grown without the need for children. Furthermore, the mechanisation of farming and the increased yields that will bring will mean that farmers will become richer as they can now sell their excess products. They're also less at risk of droughts because they can almost control that a little bit more by irrigating their lands. And as a result of that, it means that firstly, less children are obviously going to die from, or less people will die from that, on the basis that more food will be produced in the country. But in addition to that, they can also, with the additional earnings being made from a higher yield, now afford to simply pay workers to work on their farm as opposed to have lots of children. Furthermore, the country in stage 3 will go through the process of industrialisation. There'll be a move to secondary industries, which, for example, working in factories, which mean there'll be less need for children to be born. Countries that are currently in stage 3 and are experiencing this change are India and Brazil. India at the earlier ages of stage 3, Brazil actually coming to the later stages of stage 3, are countries which, quite simply, the birth rate is now rapidly declining, as you simply don't need children to work in primary industries anymore. Furthermore, in stage 3, as a country has developed over time, there'll be greater access to contraception and family planning. Now, the country's government is likely to advise people to have less children to ensure that they have enough services or infrastructure to provide education to these people. Furthermore, if you take Colombia as an example here, there is likely to be a greater gender equality, and women will now begin to pursue careers rather than children on the basis that they will want to experience that kind of independence that perhaps their earlier generations would not have had, and they want to experience this concept of a higher disposable income and a greater access to opportunities. Furthermore, I think I've already mentioned the advances in medicines, e.g. inoculations, means the death rate continues to drop as well, and therefore the population rises, but crucially at a smaller or lower rate of population growth than a stage 2 country. Take Tanzania as a stage 2 country, a 3% rise, take Brazil as a 0.8% rise, and you can start to see the impact that economic development has on the structure of a population. Looking at the stage 3 model here, what we now have, hopefully you can see at the bottom, we have much less of an incline from your early ages. The actual graph stays relatively the same width, which shows that less children are dying in the ages between 0 and 1. Don't get me wrong, when we get to the top of the graph, we can still see there is a decline when people are getting over the age of 65, as the healthcare provision isn't at the level of a stage 4 country yet. So actually the life expectancy, though increasing, hasn't quite reached that stage yet. In stage 3, you have a large number of people, economically active population. Stage 4, the stage that the UK finds itself in. Quick description of the graph first. A steady and low birth rate and death rate. A steady and low birth rate and death rate. Explanation here, we'll do the birth rate first. The birth rate is very low in the United Kingdom because children are seen as an economic liability. Those of you watching this video at home, a little figure for you, between the ages of 0 and 21, on average children cost their families around about £200,000 to £300,000 in terms of rent and electricity and uniform and sports kit and computer games and etc, etc, etc. As a result of this, parents in stage 4 countries now consider children a liability and will actually have less or potentially no children on the basis that they know that they're going to cost them a lot of money, and they have that demand for a higher quality of life. They want to enjoy their high disposable incomes and high leisure time that they were granted living in a very developed country. In addition, we've got a new group of people here, dinkies, double income, no kids yet, that's really emerged in stage 4. It's people who look at this concept of having children and wait longer to have children on the basis that they are, both male and female, are pursuing careers. If women have children later, it means that biologically they have less chance of having as many children, simply on the basis that there is less time before women reach the menopause, a time when they simply cannot have any more children. We've got highly paid and highly skilled jobs in a stage 4 country. There clearly is no need whatsoever to have a lot of children to work in the future. Death rates continue to be very, very low. And this rate actually continues to decrease on the basis that medical advances continue to reduce that death rate. For example, the advent of the incubator in the UK reduces that death rate further. Furthermore, advances in chronic illnesses mean people stay alive longer and the life expectancy rises. For example, in the UK, we now have further advances in the treatment of cancer, and as a result, the death rate continues to decline. Looking at a stage 4 model, you have a very clear declining birth rate between under the ages of 15 here, where the population pyramid itself begins to narrow. And at the top, hopefully you can see that there's a wider number of people living longer, living over the age of 65. You have a very, very large economically active population at this time as well, and this is what the UK currently has. Although the population does still increase generally, it will actually really, really slow and can be considered to be largely stationary, but the actual size of the population will be high. In a stage 4 country, you're going to see the advent of more and more quaternary jobs as well, which further adds to a lack of births on the basis that people have to work very, very long hours in very highly skilled, highly pressured jobs, and as a result, less children are born, as these people simply don't have the time to do it. So that's a stage 4 country like the UK. We'll look at a stage 5 country next. Again, students studying from 2020 onwards, you have your new example, which is the United Kingdom. It's a stage 4 HIC example. It's typical of a stage 4 country. A low birth rate on the grounds that parents don't need to have children to provide for them in the future anymore, and they're very confident that children will survive. The death rate is also low, 10 per 1,000. You may notice that that's actually the same as the Kenyan figure. That doesn't mean that Kenyan healthcare and UK healthcare is comparable in any way. What that means is that it's a low figure, but inevitably, because we've got such an elderly population now, because people live such a long time, that figure actually does become slightly higher than perhaps it would have been 10 to 15 years ago. So a death rate of 10 per 1,000 is still very, very, very low. And again, that's indicative of a very advanced healthcare system. Natural population increase of just around about 0.1% per year. Really, really important figure there, because the population is still growing. That means the UK hasn't reached the final stage of stage 5 quite yet. Life expectancy for men and women as an average is 81, very, very high life expectancy. Again, that's because of all those systems in place like pensions, nursing homes, and of course healthcare as well. Median age 41, if you think back to your Kenya example, it's 18. 41, the middle person, the average age in the UK would be 41 years old, far, far, far higher than that of Kenya. And again, it's that idea that people are now having less children, so what we end up with is a median age that is growing and will continue to grow. Okay, the final stage of this graph, when I was at school all those years ago, this was considered a hypothetical stage, where it was the belief that some countries around the world may eventually reach a stage where actually the total population would show a decline and death rates would increase above birth rates. This, however, is no longer a hypothetical stage. This is a stage that certain countries around the world, for example Italy and Japan, have now actually reached, where their death rate exceeds their birth rate. Now, the reason for this isn't a collapse in healthcare or a collapse in education or people start drinking dirty water. That's not the case. The case is because because the average age of the country is now higher, on the basis that people are having less children and on the basis that people live longer, it is inevitable that death rates will rise. Take the UK as an example. We're not currently in stage 5 quite yet, but the death rate of the UK is actually creeping up a little bit on the basis that people are simply older and are simply more likely to die through old age, and therefore the further complications with their health over a long period of time, or they could become more susceptible to disease as their immune system begins to weaken. But the concept is that the death rate rises simply because of a higher median age. So if you actually compare it, you may get some instances where a stage 4 country can actually have a death rate higher than some countries in stage 2, simply because of a higher average age, and simply the fact that people are older, they're simply more likely to die. The birth rate itself also stays very low in stage 5 for the exact same reasons as stage 4, but actually the country will be even more economically developed at this point, and therefore people will enjoy an even higher quality of life, arguably, and therefore are even less inclined to have children, so the birth rate continues to be low. What this means is a low birth rate with a steadily increasing death rate means that the overall population of the country begins to decline. Countries as examples of this are Italy and Japan that are showing a population decrease. Now then, just to recap over this model quickly, the further right across the model we are in terms of the x-axis, time axis, the more economically developed a country has become over time through technological and mechanical developments. leading to the country being more economically developed in stage 5 than it was in stage 1. And the best piece of evidence for that are the birth rate and death rate lines. Hopefully you can identify that this is showing an increasing and improving healthcare system, an increasing and improving agricultural system, and also, particularly when you get in stage 3 and 4, the impacts that children have on quality of life. Within stage 4 and stage 5, children can be considered an economic liability in that they will actually cost families money, whereas at stage 1 and stage 2, that the opposite applies. Children are economic assets. They will potentially make the family money, or alternatively increase the food security of the family. Stage 5, another way of considering stage 5, population pyramid there of Malta. This is a hypothetical one for 2050. Look at the declining birth rate you see from ages 65 or 60 downwards. Look how fewer the number of children being born is every year, and as a result of that, in the future for Malta, you can have an issue regarding how large the economically active population is to support the more elderly population that are living a very long time. So is the model accurate for Western Europe and Northern America and other HICs of the world? Yes, this model has been very, very accurate. Countries have progressed linearly through this model. However, it doesn't apply to all countries around the world. The model does not consider religious values, e.g. the banning of the use of contraception. Likewise, it does not consider government policy roles, e.g. the China one-child policy, that can hugely influence the birth rate of certain countries or regions. Take China as an example. It very, very rapidly went from a very early stage 2 to a birth rate that would be very similar to a stage 4 country without that progress through stage 3. However, probably the biggest problem with this model is it does not factor in migration. In the United Kingdom today, population is increasing, which means we are currently in stage 4. However, the reasons for this are generally put down to immigration and larger families from immigrants arriving here from Eastern Europe, adding to our birth rate. That is not factored into the model, and as a result of that, we can argue that because migration isn't considered, it means that the model doesn't apply well in an age where people are more on the move than they'd ever been before. So hopefully the DTM makes sense. Come and see us down at H7 if there's anything you're not sure about before your paper 2 exam.